This is a welcome bill. It's an unoffensive bill, but it falls well short of the benchmark. Now, I rise to speak on legislation that makes a range of mechanical, technical and structural changes to legislation governing tenancies and housing in Victoria. Changes that are sensible and understandable, but far too little to make a dent on the chronic shortage of affordable housing in our state. The government has had every opportunity since 2014 to improve housing livability, and we are only this year taking some steps. In 2014 we had 9,990 people on the priority waiting list for housing. As of March there were 30,508 people on that same damning list, and I think Mr Barton quoted a number even higher than that. So it is, the time for action is really, well, it's not now. The time for action was 8 years ago, but now we have to move. These figures expose a broken system, a system that's not worked for years, a system in chaos, delays and unwillingness to respond. Isn't housing a universal human need? The government prides itself on its big build for housing, yet until recently has all but ignored the increasing need for affordable housing. And while the government's made a promising commitment to address this issue in the latest budget, those investments won't be realised for many years. And we must be suspicious of this model of private social housing, as mentioned here today by Mr Barton too. We know all too well both of the major parties have suspect relationships with property developers. And it gives me little faith to think of an affordable housing model where developers are prioritised over residents. Well, didn't the Premier promise them super profits? Well, I don't want to deny it. As I previously raised on the issue of public housing properties such as Barrack Beacon Estate, Braybrook and Ascot Vale being neglected, and housing options being inadequately maintained and not refurbished, we need more publicly owned housing, not less. The pursuit of private contracts rather than restoring existing publicly owned housing has an adverse outcome for Victorians, both in social and economic consequences, especially the loss of publicly owned land. Such partnerships are opportunistic rather than strategic, and I hope the government soon wakes up to the mess it's creating with these complex arrangements. And just as an alternative, perhaps Australia could look to Singapore to fix our housing crisis. Mr Barton brings up Scotland, but he knows more about that one, and I've done a bit of research into Singapore. Singapore's got a population similar to Melbourne's, only they don't plan to double it over the next 25 years. But here I'm going to quote some information from an article by Cameron Murray in Australian Property on January the 21st, 2022. He said, during the past 4 decades in which home ownership amongst Australians aged 25 to 34 has sunk from around 60% to 45%, home ownership among the same age group in Singapore has climbed from around 60% to 88%. I mean, that's dreamland for us. Here, there's a good chance that's because Singapore's doing something right. What Singapore has that Australia does not is a public housing developer, the Housing Development Board, which puts new dwellings on public and reclaimed land, provides mortgages and allows buyers to use their compulsory retirement savings, what Australians call superannuation, for both a deposit and repayments. There's more to it than that. It limits eligibility by income and age, requires owners to hang on to the property for 5 years and limits their resale to only other eligible buyers. 8 in 10 of all the dwellings in Singapore today were built over the past half century by the Housing Development Board, end quote. Now, perhaps to copy this system exactly would be too much for our private developer model, but something not quite so extensive might be worth consideration, as would other models mentioned here today of public investment in housing, which have been successful in other countries. Many of these overseas models could be worth consideration today, or in this area too. However, back to today's bill, this is an unoffensive effort, but it falls well short of what we need as a community to house our people. And just to mention, you know, the Jobs and Skills Summit was mentioned today, and we say just build more homes. But just build more homes, we're building a hell of a lot of homes. You drive around Melbourne, you'll see cranes everywhere, you'll see homes and houses being developed, housing all over the place. But we have a population that's been growing, and the opposition called for more population growth today, but we've got a population that's been growing at, in Melbourne, 135,000 people per year. So that's 135,000 homes needed every year, 2,500 people per week Melbourne has been growing at pre-pandemic, which is what they want to try and bring it back to after the Jobs and Skills Summit. Now, with that sort of growth, we've got to build 2,500 homes a week, and we leave it to the private market to do that, but that's an enormous amount of housing to build. So that's just something we've got to keep in mind when we're planning to boost our population for economic reasons. That adds to the demand on housing overwhelmingly. So we've got to build that, then build more public housing as well. So this is an enormous effort and puts an enormous strain on Melbourne's infrastructure and housing, of course. It's a delicate balancing act, of course, to govern Victoria. It's not easy. And it's the opinion of Sustainable Australia Party that today's government has failed in this act to match infrastructure with the population growth and to encourage that population growth without matching infrastructure. There's been far too much money spent on purported vote-winning infrastructure projects and far too little on hospitals and homes. You know, so these are essentials for health and livability. So I don't oppose the bill, but I must strongly urge the government to start talking housing unaffordability seriously.
Thank you, Mr Hayes. Ms Barth.